Good morning, everyone. My name's Ben Lyons, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. And welcome to this presentation on which is part of a project between the University of Queensland and the University of Southern Queensland, funded by the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. And this project's entitled Informed Engagement between the Australian and Chinese Agricultural Sectors. And along with my colleagues Scott Waldron, Jing Zhang and Finn de Daunton, we are grateful for the support of the Foundation for enabling us to participate and engage with the agricultural industries from both countries, including colleagues that we're working with at the Chinese Academy for Agricultural Science in Beijing. Today, we're pleased to present in our first public event. This is as part of this project, which to date has included a number of workshops which have been industry focused. And so we welcome you all to that. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the country in which we stand, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge some distinguished guests, both in person and online, the Consul General of the from the Brisbane Consulate from the People's Republic of China, Dr. Ran Zongzi, Xie, and other colleague researchers and industry leaders, especially those that have taken the time to join us here in person, but also online. Just a little bit of housekeeping for those, particularly in person. There's some breakfast that we've got served coming a bit at 8:30 or a bit later in the morning. Must be a new enterprise bargaining agreement. We couldn't get it here any earlier, so I apologise for that if you're a little bit hungry. And also bathrooms are both to the right and to the left at the entrance there. And in the case of the emergency, walk out to the exit there and follow the signs, and we'll all be really calm. Today's presentation, and online, we're going to have the format for today, which is just, Scott and Jing are going to present for about 45, 50 minutes, and we're going to follow that with a 20-minute Q&A. If you could post those online, you can post your questions online through the chat as they come to you. That leads to lively discussion. And we've enabled the sort of mute function for everyone, but you can use the chat function at any time. I just ask that everyone be respectful of fellow participants and follow, good protocol. We are at a sort of an international relations, sort of event, and I think it's important that we be respectful of that. Today's discussion is really looking at research into the both countries' agricultural industries and the very important trade relationship they share. If you haven't already had a coffee, there are some coffee and tea available there next door. And by all means, jump out and grab one as you need. Made 2 pages. But now I'll get on to the main show. Today's title, as you can see, we're talking about, Scott and Jing are talking about China's food security policy, trade barriers in the Australian agricultural sector. I should introduce the speakers. Dr. Scott Waldron leads the University of Queensland's China Agricultural Economics Group, which is a long-term research theme and team at the University of Queensland, and a great asset to this relationship, having been formed in the late 1980s and doing projects in China since 1990. In China, Scott worked for the Economist in their intelligence unit and graduated from the Nanjing Hopkins Center for Advanced Chinese and American Studies, and is I suppose, a graduate of one of the predecessors of the National Foundation's entities in the Australia-China Council. He is fluent in Chinese. He's written 8 books on China, 2 of which have been translated into Chinese. His colleague, Dr. Jing Zhang, is a research fellow at the UQ China Economics Group, Ag Economics Group, and in the School of Agricultural and Food Sciences. She completed her PhD at UQ on weather index insurance, and she joins an illustrious alumni of a number of graduates that have come out from China and studied at the University of Queensland. She's since conducted collaborative research projects on grasslands management in China and on dairy and sheep production in Tibet. Her current research interests are agricultural policy, natural resource management, farming systems, consumer behaviour, and international agricultural trade. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Scott and to Jing, and look forward to hearing from them, and I'll get those doors shut. Thanks, Scott.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Ben, introduction and all the contribution to the project and organising these early morning events. And thanks everyone for coming out this time of the day on a foggy day for some light entertainment before everyone starts work. So thanks for coming. And as Ben mentioned, we've been doing a series of talks and workshops as part of this project funded by the foundation, and usually they're in-depth, so they're focused on particular industries, which has been beef, dairy, grains, forages. And as this is a more general sort of talk, I'm going to try and summarize the main parts of those industry studies within a general talk. So there's a lot to get through, and I hope I'll be able to get through it. So this is the topic: China's food policy, trade barriers in the Australian agricultural sector. And working. And so the outline of the talk is that first we'll look at the first part, China's food security policy, and both domestic and international terms, and then telescope down to look at particular trade barriers that have been applied to particular commodities, and our case study commodities, barley, beef and dairy, that we're going to look at. Then we're going to look at the broader processes of China's trade barriers on Australian imports over the recent years, and then some of the lessons that might have evolved from that. And so the general approach, I mean, usually we'd take a technical approach, looking at the economics of how these things work within China and internationally. But we're not doing that today. There's no forecasting. There's not much agronomy involved. It's more of a political economy approach. The barriers are partly political in nature. But you can see usually when we're talking about trade barriers, at least, especially in international relations, the emphasis is on, there's the bilateral relationship, and then that relationships has caused the barriers. But we're taking a different approach here to look at those barriers as a product of developments within China. It's a different approach to looking at it. I think that helps explain the two approaches explain what's going on, but have to be combined. And the purpose is really for general knowledge for Australian agribusiness, but also policymakers that are working in the Chinese agricultural sector to inform risk assessment and governance. So that's the general idea. And okay, I think it's the food security is such this amorphous sort of word, and I think it's important to sort of define what we're talking about. And every time you pick up a paper about China's food security or agricultural policy,
I'm coming through on the other side. It's not sharing that screen. If you just escape full screen for a minute. That screen was showing. Yeah, so that screen showing, you might want to make that bigger. When you go onto full screen, it wasn't sharing in the Zoom. Yeah, that's it. That's cool. Yep.
Can I just double check that, because it's got all the sequencing sort of in the full screen. Is that working? Is that not?
It's not coming through as the full screen in the Zoom.
Okay, yeah. All right, I'll just do it without the animations. Okay, so when think about China's food security challenges, every second paper that you read starts with this sentence that says, China has this challenge of feeding 21% of the world's population on 7% of the world's arable land. as a biophysical challenge. It's simply this Malthusian sort of approach to food security. And well, the other sort of way of looking at it, Ben and I had a colleague in the Ministry of Agriculture that defined their challenge as feeding a 70-hectare mouth every day. Feed that many people, the size of the Yangtze River. That was what kept them up at night in their part of the Ministry of Agriculture. I think the 70-hectare thing, I think they actually worked that out with some maths. But you can see the size of the challenge for China. And China's dealt with that challenge incredibly well over, thousands, hundreds of years, and in most periods in modern Chinese history. And so now there's enough food in China, right, to feed everybody. That's not the issue. But the issue really is, well, from an economics perspective, is that the price that food's available, the alignment between supply and demand, and then the price that food is delivered to market for consumers. And that's what this figure down the left-hand side is sort of saying, that Chinese food prices were incredibly low for most of the period, for recent decades, the periods that we've been working in China. But there's been a gradual inflation, and you can see these spikes in prices in particular periods due to shocks. A lot of them are disease or pest sort of problems. So SARS, African swine fever. This 2007, 2008 international food price spike was huge and very influential on thinking about food security amongst central policy makers. So you can see these particular spikes, and the problem, of course, then is food is expensive. That food prices, especially pig prices, are an important driver of overall consumer prices in China. And of course, that means that lower income sectors of society struggle to buy affordable, nutritious food during those periods. And more recently, China's problem is not so much in price inflation, but deflation in the broader economy, and including in agriculture. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, there's all these reports coming about the problems that low prices have caused in the dairy industry and the beef industry in China, for example. And so the other aspect of China's food security issue is then on trade. And I guess as an economist, we'd say that trade imports into China for food contributes to China's food security problems, right? There's more food available. And I think that's right. And I think China understands that. But then there's the flip side of that, right? That if China has high exposure to imports, then that causes vulnerabilities for China's agriculture, for Chinese society. So you can see imports have gone through the roof. And it's also interesting to note in this figure that China used to be a net exporter of food until very recently. So that's only from 2008, 2009. And then you can see the crossover period there in that figure, which I can't see because of this. And China is a large exporter of food food products. So that creates a whole series of international trade issues that we're going to talk about. Okay, and so these are the issues that are the measures that China takes to address these food security challenges. And there's two types. One is domestic and one is international, at different approaches. And I mean, we're talking about many international issues today, but all of the action, the effort really is on domestic measures, and of which there are quite a few. One is agricultural structures, others agricultural policy and agricultural technology, the idea to increase domestic production, to manage prices, rural incomes, and for import substitution, and self-reliance. zili, right? That's an important aspect for China. And okay, so just look at each of those domestic measures very quickly. And just to give you an idea of sort of how the domestic agricultural sector works in about 1 minute flat, Chinese agricultural structures are based on 3 characteristics. One is these small family farms. There's a picture of what that looks like there. The other is infrastructure and markets for farmers to be able to sell their products, consumers able to access, which has been very highly developed in China for centuries through the canals, for a start. But this intricate network of rural markets that lead to wholesale markets. And the other feature is regional specialization. So particular areas going particular type of grains, other areas going cash crops, and so on. And that's been, in place for 5 centuries now. That has enabled China largely to feed itself, short of big weather pest shocks, until the central planning era. And that's where family farms were disbanded and formed into collectives and communes. So the 5,000 farms integrated into a commune that couldn't make their own decisions, were told what to do, what to plant, when to plant, how to harvest it, and so on. And importantly, that instead of this regional specialization, farmers doing what they're good at, were told to produce grain. That was the imperative at the time in China. And that was seen to be important for China. And it led to the Great Leap Forward, right? A massive disaster. And not just food insecurity, but starvation and disease and conflict and everything else. And the reform era was from 1978, was really, when you look at it, a reversion back to those traditional agricultural structures, family farms, markets, rural specialization, that led to another series of problems, right? Highly fragmented systems. Small farms running around selling generic low-quality products through all these markets, that China then has tried to modernize. So allowing farmers to lease their land to other farmers or to companies, more direct forms of marketing through contracts or vertical integration to modernize agriculture. And that's really, it's just incredible to see what's happening in the modernization of Chinese agricultural sector, accompanied by all these massive amounts of policy measures. So this figure shows the increase in agricultural research and development funding in, so what's that, $10 billion a year by 2015, and China outstripping other countries in that field through this network of 4 million extension agents, right? That's the 3rd largest arm of the Chinese state after health and education. And subsidies, right? And you can see, at equivalent levels of development than other countries, US, Europe, Japan, and so on, we're also subsidizing agriculture highly. But that's declined, of course, over the years for most countries, but not China, where subsidies are increasing, although the nature of those subsidies have changed. And so this little section is just the idea is just to give you a feel about sort of what's been happening, or more sensationalist, the sort of issues that have been on social media and the media in Chinese agricultural policy in recent years. And a big part of that is the use of arable land. So China's been losing a lot of agricultural land because of urbanization, industrialization, everything. So this red line was drawn. Okay, we can't lose any more land. The Gengdi Hongxian set at 1.8 billion mu. And this was a top-down measure, right? Supported at the highest levels. And there's all these interesting flow-on effects from that, things that have been happening within China. So these are things that my students put together, actually. When China went to measure the amount of arable land available, it did through remote sensing. So local government officials went out and put soil, in this case on basketball courts, on rooftops, on roads, so that it appears like there's more cultivated land. And there's all this controversial China controversy about the reversal of the Grain for Green program. That's where, after floods in the late 90s, that China planted an enormous amount of trees on sloping land to stop floods and to replace cultivated land to do that, right? But now there's been a reversal of that, the taking out of trees and replacing that with cultivated land. And most importantly, that this red line involves not just cash crops, it's got a more emphasis and regulation about planting staple crops, rice, wheat, corn on the arable land. And part of that, the enforcement of those sort of rules, was the development of this agricultural law enforcement system. So this is Nongguan, like, you know, in China, there's a Chengguan to regulate administrative laws in cities. Well, now that's been applied in rural areas, not from the police, but under the Ministry of Agriculture, that go around enforcing these sort of regulations and activities, illegal activities happening in China, the appropriate use of pesticides and counterfeiting and so on. So that's some of the issues that have been, you know, big issues in Chinese ag policy in the last few years. And there's all sorts of debate about whether this is the right way to go. And here's a prominent agricultural economist saying, okay, it's good to have all these contingency factors, but we shouldn't get too carried away about that on a daily life. And his big point is that China's comparative advantage is not in land-intensive products, right, for grains, but in labor-intensive products, higher value products that increase farmer incomes, which is, you know, horticulture and cash crops, livestock. And here's a slide to try and summarize how China's going with its self-sufficiency levels. So you can see up the top here, here's the three staple grains: rice, wheat, maize. And China is, I can't quite see those figures, that might be, so that 95% self-sufficient in those grains. And one of the reasons is that they're protected by quota. So when China joined the WTO, the emphasis was on grains. And everything else, all these other products, feed and livestock products, they were low priced compared to international markets. So China didn't worry about protections. The overall level of tariffs for those other products are very, very low, 15% on average, not protected by high tariffs or quota. So China's nearly self-sufficient in those food grains for human consumption, but the situation's changed since 2001 when China joined the WTO, right? Incomes have increased, and as incomes increase, people don't want to eat more rice. They eat higher value products, you know, with positive income elasticity. So the demand has been for seafood and meat. And so for those meat products, for the monogastric animals, we're talking chickens and pigs especially, that's fine. China's good at that. That's land-sparing activities. You don't need broadacre farming to do that. China's very good at that. The problem is in the feed for those animals, right? Which really is corn, protected by quota, but all these other feeds, barley, sorghum, and other feeds that we'll talk about there. And that's where China has this big low levels of self-sufficiency. You can see soybeans are down to 17%, for example. And China, as we talked about, has made enormous efforts to try and increase the yields of those feeds. It just approved the use of, after years and years, the use of GMO soybeans and corn in 20-something provinces across China. Has all these elaborate sort of systems, and this shows intercropping of corn and soybeans, but there are limits to that too, right? They're both summer crops. So there's only so much land you can use for both of those crops. And this shows intercropping, but that doesn't improve overall yields that much because of the shading effects and competing for nutrients and problems of getting harvesters and so on. And then this next picture here shows a piggery in China. So this is a high-rise piggery. You can see the scale, the mechanization that you can bring. They're really capital-intensive sort of industries at an enormous scale that China can do very well. But down the bottom here, we have a smallholder farmer. And so we're talking about the cattle and beef sector. You can industrialize parts of the beef sector. You can have massive feedlots, pouring the feed into them, highly efficient weight gains and everything else. But for cow-calf production, it's different, right? You can't hold them in pens or feedlots or indoors. They have to be outdoors, grazing, and that's a land-intensive activity. Cattle just aren't raised in extensive systems like they are in Australia, in China. China's got the same amount of grasslands as Australia, but they're too cold. Cattle don't graze there. State farms don't have cattle. So they're only in smallholder systems, right? On a small scale. And farmers like this guy that we've got in the photo, well, not so much him, but especially the younger generations, no longer have incentives to raise 2 cows, right? Because they can get jobs in the city or, around there, like there is at a much higher paying. So there's high opportunity costs of raising cattle. And so there's just very, very strict limits to which China can increase its beef herd, despite all the policies, right? So I guess the lesson from all this is that firstly, when we're talking about China's food security, we're really talking about feed security. And secondly, there are strict limits to which China can use to increase production. And so now we're talking about food security from an international perspective. China recognizes that imports are part of the mix for food security. It can't be completely self-sufficient, but that those imports are not done through this liberal system. They're to be managed, blocked or encouraged to reach these objectives. And just to show how these sort of different dynamics work, here's some statements from Chinese agricultural policymakers that show the diversity of views over time and industry and everything else. So here's Li Keqiang, who's a long-serving member, the head of Premier of China's State Council for a decade, talking about beef, saying, okay, that we have to determine the import policy to strengthen and promote further opening. And the reason why that statement, followed by policy, was made, because in that period, 2014, there was an enormous amount of smuggling of beef into China because high tariffs and then disease protocols, mainly foot and mouth, mad cow disease. And so 20% of China's beef supply was being smuggled over the border, Hong Kong, Vietnam, Myanmar. And at the same time, prices were going through the roof for beef. You can see in that period here, 2014. And so the decision was made to open up, liberalize imports of beef through measures we'll talk about. Okay, and here's another different perspective. So this is Ni Hongxing, who's spent his life in the Ministry of Agriculture. He was the Deputy Director General of International Cooperation of MARA, agreeing with Li Keqiang, we have to ensure basic supplies, but in several articles that he's wrote saying China has excessive supplies of soybean, cotton, wool, canola, barley, dairy, and sugar. We need domestic export for bulk commodities, but we can't use some policy instruments, especially price support domestically, because if prices increase, if price support is increased within China, it'll make them higher prices than international prices, which will flood the market. So the original policy instruments don't work. Tariffs and quotas are not the domestic price policy is not an effective mechanism. So we have to use these other mechanisms known as Liangfan Yibao, so anti-dumping legislation, and countervailing duties. So that's another perspective from the Ministry of Agriculture. And here's the one that matters. So this is Xi Jinping, chairman, president, the head of, I think it's up to 10 different committees in China that makes decisions, but importantly, sets the tone through statements that filter down through the system and picked up by local government, industry, and everyone else. And IR people in the room will know that over the Xi regime, starting 2013, there's been this increased emphasis on securitization of everything. Territorial securitization, military, technological securitization, propaganda, food security, biosecurity, everything. And it's reflected in these sort of statements. Chinese people must hold the rice bowl in their own hands. And then this statement about dairy. And that's reflected, intensified in recent years because of COVID and the US-China trade war, and then implemented through these series of food security regulations, including 2024 food security law. So an overall increase in securitization. And I don't know what you think, but when I talk to my IR mates, when they think food security, they think about measures that will reduce China's vulnerability to major events, including war, as we've seen Russia and Ukraine, blockades in the South China Sea, or sanctions. So I think that's right. I think that's part of the logic, really. But really, the concern, day-to-day concerns of Chinese policymakers are more about prices. We mentioned the international price hike. That was accompanied with export bans. Prices are really high. Countries all over the world didn't want to export their food, keep it within the country, so put bans on exports and leaves countries, net importers like China, in a vulnerable position. Shocks from weather, disease, pests, and all, as we were talking about before, if there's high food price inflation, that can lead to social unrest in China, which has happened in Chinese history. And so, again, being sort of geopolitical about it, we did a full literature search on this and went through a whole lot of interesting papers. And here's one from the South Council Development Research paper, how China agricultural imports for land-intensive imports are concentrated on just a few countries which are connected by sea. Leaves China in a vulnerable position. And so the idea is to diversify into Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia, etc., which are connected by rail as part of this diversification process. And then more than that, there's all these, it's just an enormous field, number of studies on other aspects of China diversification. We should buy from more countries with seasonal complementarity, north, south, global planning distribution, especially of corn. So there's a smoother flow of imports into China. Increase the imports from countries with a high dependence on China, because then they're less likely to cut off supply. Buy from countries with higher price elasticity of supply. So, if there is a shock, if there is an increase in prices, then those countries are more likely to respond with high supply, which will help China. So there's all these sorts of recommendations amongst scholars and policymakers that filter down into the system, into China's import diversification policy. And you can see the results of that. So this pie graph at the top showed that Australia and the US completely dominated China's imports of grains in general in 2012, and by 2023 it's diversified enormously. And similar for other products, and this is just the case of beef. Most beef was imported from Australia, and now it's just an enormous number of countries. So that's the diversification process, which is actively done through a series of instruments. And that's what's listed on this left-hand side here. the instruments that are available to China to diversify and manage trade. So we have tariff and quota instruments, rates, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, and tariff rate quota administration, then a whole series of non-tariff barriers, bilateral import protocols, standards and regulations about the characteristics of the food, customs refusal, and then exporter permits. These are non-tariff barriers. And so what we did is line up those barriers against the products where China applied barriers on Australian imports from 2020 to 24, and then added this one, dairy, and identified what instruments China used to impose those barriers. And there's a lot of them. We've been through all of them, but what we're going to talk about quickly today are these ones in yellow. So barley, anti-dumping, countervailing duties. Beef was through technical barriers that meant that their permits were suspended. And dairy, there weren't barriers applied, particularly on dairy, but dairy's caught up in these change in standards within the industry. So I'll just go through quickly, I hope, the story for each of those. Firstly, barley. And there was a backstory here for barley. I mean, I don't know what you think, but in 2020, it was announced that China would prohibit 80% tariffs on the import of Australian barley, and was seen to be a problem in the bilateral relationship that happened then. Well, that's only half the story. This is the much longer term and I think more important story. Going back to 2007-8, the international price spike hike internationally. That's what's shown here. There's this big increase in the prices of corn. China was worried about the export ban, so wanted to increase domestic corn production and did so by increasing the price floors. This is the state procurement prices for corn incrementally over this time. So you can see that's those black lines that led to increasing corn prices in China. And as those domestic prices were increased, it made them more expensive relative to imported prices, right? And at the same time, China was stuck with all this corn that it's bought at low prices in storage, 250 million tons of corn. So that led to what's known as the three highs problem: high prices, high storage, and high imports. But the imports weren't of corn, right? Because that's protected by quota. The imports were of feed substitutes for corn, which is these products: distillers grain, sorghum, maize, and barley. And China then tried to manage that, firstly by selling off its stocks of corn at much lower prices, so there's huge losses from that, developing an ethanol program, but purposes today through trade barriers of those feeds. And well, the short story then, China spent another 4 to 5 years drawing down those corn stocks, and then drawing them back up again because Asian swine fever, there was recovery from that, so needed more corn. And in recent years, China's been importing a lot of grains in general because of good harvests and prices everywhere else. But the important thing here is this three highs period. So we're talking 2011 to 2015. And we've talked about a series of grains there, but this is barley. This is the one that's important for Australia, right? And this shows a number of things. The green bars show Chinese domestic barley production, and you can see it going down. China used, under central planning, Ministry of Agriculture, planted barley for the Ministry of Commerce to use for brewers and feed companies under its jurisdiction. With reform, there's just less interest in barley in China, and then all the emphasis on corn. So there's this big decline in domestic barley production until 2020, when China imposed the barriers on Australian barley, when there's been an increase. And if you looked at this, you'd think, okay, stopped importing so much Australian barley, so domestic production increased, but that's not what happened. This is a statistical anomaly where China combined barley, normal sort of feed barley, with this other type of barley, highland barley. It's a naked type of barley that's grown across the highland areas, Qinghai and Tibet. Combined that as a statistical item and said, great, our production's bounced back, but it's only a statistical reason. So Chinese barley production has declined. And at the same time, the blue lines show the massive increase in China's imports in barley over that 3 highs period. That's what's shown in the blue lines. And as a result of that, this orange line shows the proportion of domestic production in total supply of barley, which went declined down to, so what's that, nearly 15% something. It means China imported 85% of its barley, and this blue line shows how much of it those imports came from Australia, which was in some years nearly 75%. So that's what's known as the Australian barley choke point. The chowboards, right? And China just doesn't want to be exposed to that kind of vulnerability from any country, but especially Australia. And that really is what led to the investigations into the dumping of Australian barley that was reviewed by MOFCOM, that ruled on it, imposed 80.5% tariffs. Australia then went to the WTO to appeal those tariffs, which we don't know, because there wasn't, Australia suspended that case because before there was a public ruling on it, right? But it's understood that the ruling was in Australia's favour, not China's. Australia suspended the case, which gave a face-saving way for China to drop those tariffs in its review, so they were dropped recently, end of last year. So it's just old-fashioned protectionism, right? Not economic coercion. Although what I would say is that China could have dropped those tariffs earlier, after the investigation in 2018, by 2020, like it did for US sorghum at an earlier period. But because the relationship wasn't great, they said, okay, we'll go ahead with these tariffs, is my interpretation of it. And then there were tariffs from the 3 high periods, there were tariffs applied on other products, US dried distillers grain, and those same instruments was nearly the carbon copy of the Australian barley case was used against Australian wine for the same reason. Australian wine imports going through a roof, outcompeting Chinese products, so China applied tariffs on it. And then more recently for brandy. So that's on anti-dumping instruments. And then at the same time, during that 3 highs period, that China was using the administration of quotas and tariffs in an non-transparent way. US took them to the WTO and won that case. So you can see the background there of how this works, right? Domestic developments led to international trade policy. And one of the interesting things about this is that nearly all of those anti-dumping measures, countervailing, were this particular industry body had a key role in nearly all of them, and it's the China Alcoholic Drinks Association, a massive organization, and it's comprised of a series of different sub-associations. And interestingly, those sub-associations take a very different perspective on trade policy depending on the commodity or their interests. So you can see, this is the China Ethanol Sub-Association. Well, it was the applicant in the dumping of US dried distillers grain. Can anyone think why that might be the case? Because have these massive big ethanol producers in China, and a byproduct of that is distillers grain, right? It's a important part of their revenue. And then imports were going through the roof. Domestic producers didn't want to compete with imports, so then like anti-dumping legislation. And US didn't appeal that, by the way, and I think that's caught up with the subsidies involved within the US ethanol program. In the case of Australian wine, the Wine Sub-Association was the applicant for dumping of Australian wine. And that sub-association represents about 100 massive wineries in China, right, that were competing against Australian imports, didn't like it, applied for anti-dumping tariffs. And same with brandy recently. Okay, so that's where these organizations have supported trade barriers on imports. But then there's other organizations that have made submissions against those imports, and including US sorghum. So the Baijiu Association, that white wine liquor, a big part of the imports is from sorghum, including US sorghum. So it wanted the sorghum from the US. So it made submissions against those trade barriers, which were dropped. It was successful. And interesting that the case of Australian barley, same, the beer sub-association needs Australian barley, right? And so it made submissions against those barriers, both in the initial investigation and then the review by MOFCOM. And it's fascinating reading like some of the nature of those submissions that, you know, if you stop these imports of Australian barley, we don't have the raw materials that meet specifications for the Chinese beer industry. And this is contradictory. Chinese government policy is contradictory. You can't expect us to engage in this industrial upgrading and international competitiveness if we can't access the raw materials. And we can't produce beer that meets the national standards of China. That was the nature of those arguments, along with other submissions from the Chinese Feed Association and Australian organizations. And that was eventually successful. So one of the things to emerge from that is the importance of domestic industry lobby groups within China in pursuing trade laws and regulations. And if you look at the Australian barriers, there's a number of organizations that help to stop the barriers. One was barley, we were talking about. Coal was similar. Chinese smelters saying we need good Australian coking coal, and logs too. And what you'll note here is that those industry groups that were lobbying against the barriers were accessing raw materials from China, right? They need those raw materials for further processing, big companies, a lot of employment, right? That was their interest, to access those products from Australia. But there's a lot less support within China for final or especially luxury products, where you're importing the finished good, like wine, bring in Australian wine, there's not much else to do with it. And it's competing against the Chinese wine. And similar for beef, right? You're buying beef, and the big industries, the China Beef Industry Association, the China Meat Association, their members are, abattoirs. They don't want more Australian beef. That's not in their interest. So they weren't vocal against the barriers that China imposed. And then on the import side, there are industry associations that represent importers, but they're just not as powerful. They're a rabble. There's 1,500 importers of Australian beef, so they're not going to get organised really to lobby government. So, and so these interest groups are very important. And one of the features of them, those big industry groups, is that they've devolved from government departments. So whatever the Chinese Barley Sub-Association was under the China Alcoholic Drinks Association was under the Ministry of Light Industry, then became the Bureau of Industry, was demoted. And these government departments then had to become industry associations, not part of, they didn't receive government funding, had to go out and do their own activities through membership which are big companies and provide services for them, information and conferences and lobbying, etc. So all these industries have a background in government that need to represent the interests of their members, but at the same time have this background in government. And importantly, there are regulations that, the industry associations can't just do whatever they want in their interests, that key functions in foreign affairs and in party building don't belong to the industry associations. They belong to the party state that can override them. So you can, so you can see these dynamics in interest groups within China, the way they operate, have all sorts of implications for Australian industry. And that's what we've been working with those groups about, which we won't go into here. So that's barley. That's the sort of like longest one for barley. And here's the story for beef. And beef is a completely different set of barriers, and they're much more technical. And so the general story for beef, as we saw in the previous slide, is this immense diversification of import sources for China. And that's an important aspect of that, is the protocols between countries to allow exports from particular countries. And see, Australia had a protocol as the first country, really, 2011. And you can see this proliferation of countries that then have access to China over that time period. And so that's one set of potential barriers that have been liberalized enormously. But then sort of underneath that, there's a set of standards, technical standards, food safety standards, administrative standards. And they're inspected, at least on the way into China, by GAC, so the General Administration of China Customs. And there's this National Food Supervision Inspection Center that publishes all its cases that it's picked up of food into China, which is just this enormous database. Well, it's in PDF format, so it's not really a database that we've gone through every item since 2006. And when I say we, what I mean is Jing, who went through the database, cleaned it, organized it to develop results. And it's a really there's 47,000 different entries that cover all these variables for food, all this information, the commodity, the import source, the producer, the reasons, and so on. And so we interrogated the database to produce some sort of results, especially for beef, but other products. But before we get into beef, here's the general story for China's food refusals since 2006. So you can see the blue bars, so just the number of refusals per year. Yeah, per year, right? And you can see they go up and down a bit for various reasons, which are important actually for Australian industry. But the overall trend is steady. Like the number of food refusals hasn't increased that much over time. In fact, that's the fitted line there that's gone down in terms of number of cases. But over that period, the food imports into China have gone through the roof, right? Rocketed. So if you look at it from the number of food refusals as a function of the value of imports, then there's the incidence of hold up food refusals in China has gone down a lot over that period, with some oscillations, of course. But if you look at it closely, there's other things that emerge, and this disaggregates the countries that those food refusals come from, just in number of cases, right? And like Australia complains about food hold up in China all the time, but it's nothing compared to Japan, United States, Taiwan, which are far more than Australia. But we're more than Canada and New Zealand, just in terms of number of cases. And then if you normalize those figures based on the total value, this measures the number of refusals per import value. So New Zealand, for example, only had one case of food refusal per $600 million of exports to China, food. Canada's pretty up there, Australia's in the middle, and then United States and Japan get picked up all the time. And that's, I mean, an IR person would look at that and say, that's political. You can see the countries that are being targeted, right? Japan, the United States, Taiwan's treated as a separate customs entity for these purposes. Taiwan seems political, and I think it is, but it's also because of the nature of the products that they export, which are, there's a lot of fish involved. Fish, and what was the other item, Jing, that is picked up a lot in the food refusal data? I think that's the main thing, but there's, yeah. And so that's one pattern to emerge. And then this is for beef in particular. So this is the stated reasons for the refusals of Australian beef that, you know, they've always been there, right? But increased 2020, 2021 when relations were bad. And importantly, the reasons for that hold up are not because of, you know, residues or SBS, sanitary, phytosanitary reasons, they're for administrative reasons. Australian beef has been picked up for these reasons, like failure to get permission, mislabeling, miscertification. And then if you look further at the places, the ports where this product is being picked up, it's really just in a handful of ports. And one of them is Shenzhen, but especially Shanghai. A lot of Australian beef and food gets picked up in Shanghai. Shanghai is known to be very strict, right? But then there's other cases too, like in Qingdao in 2022. And we'll get onto this, but I mean, I'll talk about it later. So because of those food refusals, because they've been picked up for misadministration and so on, China has then gone and suspended the export permits of those companies that were exporting, right? And that's what we can see here. Australia had, well, at the beginning of 2024, it was 7 plants, but before that was 9, I think was at the most, right? And now it's down to 2. There's other things going on there, but we'll just bypass that for now. And then, so that's the story for beef, the trade barriers imposed on beef, these technical sort of measures as a trade barrier. Milk is a different story again. How are we going for time, Ben? 5:10, all right. All right, I'm going to skip milk because milk. Well, Jing did all this research on milk, and there's a whole, you know, presentation and documents and data about that, and it really is very fascinating. And I don't know, you probably remember in 2008 there was this huge food safety problem in China, the melamine instrument incident, where melamine, which is a type of plastic, is being put into milk to increase the protein levels, tested proteins of the milk, that was causing all sorts of problems, including the livers of babies. And so China, from that it was a crisis, has then gone about trying to build the Chinese dairy industry, and incredibly successfully. It's amazing, the figures that are coming out, and that's what's shown in the pink here. So this is the output from 2008, the time we're talking about the increase in Chinese milk production, especially in recent years. And over that early period, so we're talking 2008, 2018, there was an increase in imports of dairy products and in general, and the way this is measured, the way that Jing measured this, there's all sorts of different dairy products, right? You can see them here: cheese, whole milk powder, skim milk powder, everything else. Jing used conversions to turn that into milk equivalents, right? And you can see over that period, big increase in domestic production, decline in imports, and And if you use those milk equivalent conversions, China's nearly 80% self-sufficient in milk. And that's happened on the production side, policies, but especially in food quality and standards for domestic products that have improved enormously, and this change in consumer demand for milk. And Jing and colleagues, including me, did this choice modeling exercise in China, survey of about 1,000 households. There's a lot going on there, but the results really are that Chinese consumers, especially mums, are still incredibly interested in food safety and quality attributes. And in the past, that used to mean you buy more expensive stuff, or you buy foreign infant milk formula as a proxy for more safe and higher quality product. And what Jing found is that attitude has changed dramatically now, that Chinese consumers are more confident in domestic products and were more willing to buy better value domestic products with more assurance that it's going to be safe. So that's led to change in import structures, and this is the decline of exports of Australian dairy products, especially infant milk formula, to China over those years, caused by those domestic developments, I think, more than trade barriers. So there's not really very many trade barriers on imported milk at all. You see this big diversification in companies registered to export to China from that same data we were talking about. There's very few cases of holdup for different Australian dairy products going into China, unlike beef and other food products. But I guess the form of non-tariff barrier that could be seen to be used is more in standards. So China's tightened all these standards for registration of companies that export to China by the State Administration of Market Regulation, increased more stringent standards from the National Health Commission and the administration, and changes in regulation in labelling. So those two measures apply to foreign and domestic companies, although they're inspected by different administrations. But these are labelling requirements that affect Australian exporters. You can no longer, and on the labelling of products like this, you can no longer say this is an imported milk, or this milk was reconstituted from from imported milk powder, including raw milk powder. You can't use non-polluted milk. What's that mean, Jing? Wugong. No, you can't say it's polluted or non-polluted. And you can't use images of babies or women on the labeling anymore. So that's sort of what it looks like. In the past, there was this sort of labeling saying this is imported milk, by which we nudge, nudge, wink, wink, it's safe. And you can't put pictures of babies, including Western babies that look healthy, and then Chinese mums are going to say, right, that's a healthy baby, I'll buy that. You have to take off that sort of labeling to more generic labeling. And then there's this sort of advertising taking place, right? Buy Chinese Feihe milk powder because it's more suited to Chinese characteristics. So that's the sort of things, subtle sort of things that could be termed as a trade barrier. And by the way, China's about to revise its beef grading system to suit Chinese characteristics too. So that's just something about the case study industries. And now I just want to generalize what all this means for these trade barriers that China imposed on Australian exports in that period, 2020. There's still a few for lobsters and a few beef plants. And I don't know, I'm sure all of you were interested in what was happening at the time from May 2020. And then it was beef, barley, and it was just like every second week there was another product, lobsters, cotton, copper, iron ore, etc. And then as China watchers were just looking at us with some questions like, what the what the hell's going on here? What are the objectives of these barriers? How are they being targeted? What industries being chosen, what weren't? What the impacts on Australia would be, the costs that would apply on the economy or particular industries, and then how the policymakers and industry would respond. There's a number of different ways they could respond. And finally, how do we sort of get rid of these barriers? So there's a whole series of questions there within a very fluid environment with very murky information that we're trying to work out. And so we started doing that. Well, I worked with colleagues from ANU, Darren Lim and Victor Ferguson, to try and work that out by falling back on international sanctions theory. And there's a number of characteristics of this. Firstly, the Chinese sanction, so we had to second guess what's going on. We didn't really know what's going on. And part of the reason is because Chinese sanctions, usually thought of as economic coercion, is informal. It's very different to normal sanctions, which are formal. So whatever, if the US doesn't agree with Iran's nuclear weapons program, testing regime, there's a law within the US that they can use to access Iranian information, usually in alliance with other countries with a defined objective. This is what we want. And if you don't have that objective, then we're going to apply sanctions. We're not going to buy your oil. It's formalized. China doesn't do that. China uses what is called informal sanctions, where it doesn't say, Australia, we don't agree with your policy choices, so we're not going to buy your products. It doesn't say that. We have to second guess what's going on, right? Which makes it all very difficult to work out what's happening. But this is usually thought of as a case of economic coercion. Australia and all these policies, the extradition agreement didn't pass through Parliament. Foreign interference legislation didn't allow Huawei or ZTE to form part of our 5G network in critical infrastructure. So on, the so-called 14 demands that were released by the Chinese embassy in Australia, including investigations of the origins of COVID-19. So the idea is that there are policy things China doesn't like, and so it aims to impose costs on Australia so that it will change its policies. That's what coercion is, or to impose costs on particular industries so that they jump up and down and lobby the government to change the policies. That's the way coercion is usually thought of, in a targeted way. So to aim at industries that will impose the highest costs on Australia and the least costs on China. That's the theory, asymmetric targeting, asymmetric costs. That was the theory, and it's very hard to see how that worked in this case, that especially on the targeting side. So the China's barriers were, if that was the objective to impose maximum cost, they weren't well targeted at all. And I think part of the reason is because there's all these other things going on. It's not just to impose costs. Part of the logic of the barriers were these other objectives. Protectionism, like we saw for barley and wine, right? They're mixed up with coercive objectives. And I think importantly, think of, I don't know, sometimes you think, right, here's a toolkit that Chinese policymakers to go, we've got all these instruments at our disposal. We've got all these industries, right? We're going to pick particular instruments to apply in a strategic way. There's someone sitting up in the State Council, thinking all this through to apply maximum costs. I don't think that's how it worked at all. Because then that's reflected in the mistargeting, but also because that in a lot of cases, as we saw, there was hold up in customs by local government officials who I think most of them were reading signals from higher levels. Like Australia, we've got a bad relationship with Australia, the food security, COVID, problems with the US. And so a local port official then would think, okay, I'm going to hold up beef that's coming through. And if I do that, I'm probably not going to get in trouble because I've read the tea leaves from Beijing. In fact, I might get a promotion and apply those barriers. And I think that's what's happening in beef, lobsters, logs, and foragers, right? So in that case, it's we're not talking about precise targeting here. We're talking about expediency. You know, the export license of Australian forage companies were coming up for renewal. They just slow walked it because relations weren't good. So there's a lot of things going on there. And we've gone through the targeting logic for all of these big exports to China that we don't have time to go into now, but I think you can see what we're saying. In the case of beef, I think just expediency was the reason for the beef. Barley, there were protectionist motives. Dairy is a bit different again. And partly because, I mean, this says dairy, it's a big export item, but if it's disaggregated into cheese, skim milk powder, everything else, they're actually quite small items, right? So I think that's part of the idea. And then we looked at the costs of the trade barriers, and that's what's shown in this figure here, right? That these are the exports in US billion-dollar terms of the 9 sanctioned commodities, which are listed here, shown for China. So there were significant export items, ran into political problems, just flatlined. There was nothing going into China. But at the same time, this is world exports for those commodities, sanctioned commodities, total world exports that increased dramatically at that time. Even though they were highly exposed to China, they were just diverted to other countries. And at the same time, prices were good, harvest, the rain was good. So the apparent costs on Australia were really low. It didn't hurt us at all when you look at the figures. And I mean, that's just the apparent cost, right? Because we still could have been selling to China at a higher price. And then there was other modeling done to show what the effects, the broad-based effects would be on the Australian economy by a piece of Prime Minister and Cabinet, who found that those barriers decreased Australia's GDP by 0.01%. So it's a rounding error, right? Didn't hurt the economy at all. But those effects vary by industry. And so this is the what happened for barley. See very high exports. China completely dominated our exports of barley up until that period, 2020, went to zero, but world exports increased. So it seems like there weren't any costs on barley, but if you look in more detail at the prices, so this compares the difference between Australian barley prices and French barley prices, and Australian barley prices went down compared to international comparisons because of the barriers. And we're talking to grain producers last week, right? Ben was saying, you know, that's $30 a ton, which is our profit margin. So farmers felt it. And then ABARES did other modeling to show what they felt. I mean, the exports had, the export bans hurt the Australian barley sector, exports, but it didn't change cultivated area very much. People didn't move out of barley that much. And then the lower prices were of benefit of users of that barley domestically, which is mainly feed. So after that all sort of sorted out, it cost us, the barley industry, $330 million. I don't know if that's a lot. Agriculture's a $80 billion sector now, isn't it, Ben? So anyway, that's some of the lessons that came out of that. And the lessons, what are the lessons for Australian agribusiness? And I guess agribusinesses, or at least their boards, will be looking at the returns of dealing with China versus the risks, right? So you can see risks are often seen in geopolitical terms, right? Relations with China, other trade conflicts globally as a risk. But what I'm trying to say here, that a lot of the risks in working with China don't come from these geopolitical problems. Many of them come from within China. Changes in policy that we're talking about for barley, for example, and all these other things that happen within China that has to be understood. And then, there's other risks about where the Chinese economy is going that have to be weighed up against the returns. And the returns really for China are price premiums, so more higher prices for China, but not just price premiums. For some products, some industries, the real value in dealing in China is you can sell low value product. So instead of just rib fillet, you can sell flaps or whole carcasses to China. Or instead of just big wide diameter logs, you can sell small diameter, the thinnings, for example, and at scale. So companies understand that. And then I don't know if you saw, but recently, it was only about a month ago, there was modeling that was published by the OECD that made these sort of conclusions, that while China has dominated growth in food consumption for decades now, that account for 20%, 28% of growth, that's expected to fall to 11%, and that other areas, Southeast Asia and India, will be the driver of food consumption growth internationally in general, but including for feed and livestock feeds. So I think that's the other thing that Australian exporters should be thinking about. And then, okay, so the overall question that we usually ask for groups is, okay, what do you take out of this sanctions that China applied on Australian exports? And there's two ways to look at it. Firstly, it's a huge shock to the system, right? It was unexpected. So is that then the message to understand those risks and diversify away from China? Is that the message? Or is that China applied all these sanctions and it didn't have very high costs on Australia, adapted very efficiently. And so if it happens again in future, there are pretty low risks involved in being highly exposed to China. So we'll just get back into China. And I'm not sure of the answer for that. This gives some indication. I see 35% of Australian agricultural, forestry, fishery exports went to China. 2019, it dropped down to pretty low, 15%. Now it's more like 25%. That's sort of an indication, but it's just really a sort of very disaggregated perspective. All these things, the risk versus return calculus depends on the industry that you're in, or if you're a big company, small company, there's lots of nuances there. These are all things that we're all trying to work out, I think. So there are, I think I'd just leave it there. It's already over time, Ben.
Thanks, Scott. We've got some time for a question. I know people might have to race off to work or to other commitments, but appreciate your time. We do have a bit of time for those online and both hearing some questions. So let's use that time while we've got Scott. Yes, Andrew.
I'll get in early.
Yes, please, mate.
I was sitting on a session that I think Scott, you were part of 3 or 4 years ago when we were talking about the barley saga, and it struck me that China was trying to, when the brewing industry was importing 70% of its brewers' malt barley from Australia, and the whole industry had spent 2 decades getting the barley to exactly the right protein and exactly the right whiteness or length or something, get it. The Chinese government was actually beating up their own industry and saying, why can't you buy it from the Ukraine, Argentina, etc., France, and then force them to do it, and they got inferior product. And then Australia just woke up and stopped planting barley pretty much the same day, switched it to wheat, and then wrote it out. And So, you know, we're, as a business company, export nuts, macas, pecans, all that sort of stuff. China is the market. It's a big. So our industry went into panic when they just say wine, barley, macadamias. That'd be the end of this. We just put it up. So my point, or maybe my question is this more about forcing their own industry to diversify than it is, in that case, in that barley case, than it was anything to do with the broader supply chain?
Forcing Australian industry
No, forcing their own
Chinese
industry.
importers.
Because it looked to me back then that they warned their own importers and said you have to get under 50%. And they were at 45, don't hit 50 or we're going to whack you. And they got to 50, 60, 70. And all of a sudden, it's a trade barrier.
Yeah.
It's a blunt tool. Tariff is a blunt tool, but it totally affects everyone.
Yes, definitely.
Because they don't just say, well, we're just going to do it for you personally.
Yeah.
Your company.
That's right. Yeah. No, thanks for that question. It's a very good question. And I guess it gets back to this point about, you know, what was the logic, the rationale that China was using for this targeting. And like in the case of barley, it's a bulk commodity. So if you can't sell it to China, you can sell it anywhere. Saudi Arabia was the big one, right, for feed, albeit at a discount. Didn't hurt Australian barley industry that much. Even though, as you say, it spent decades setting up for the Chinese industry, including sort of inbreeding or developing this new standard, fair average quality standard, not quite food grade, not feed grade, but what brewers wanted. But Australia rode that out. But the costs on an Australian industry were much less than the costs on the Chinese sector, especially the brewers, but also feed sector. I think ABARES calculated that there was a lot higher cost than China. So it wasn't, it was asymmetric costs that were asymmetric against China. And I think the reason for that, I don't think that was fully thought through within China. I don't think they worked that out. The Ministry of Agriculture would have been really important, just all those things you're talking about. Chinese brewers setting up their everything, their standards, their instruments, their marketing strategies, everything for Australian barley. I think that was just beyond the decision makers, and the Ministry of Agriculture was saying, no, it's too much Australian barley, we want more Chinese barley and we want diversification. And as they found out, it just doesn't work like that in industry. And so it was just a miscalculation. It's a whole series of mistakes, bungles that China made through this whole episode, and that's one of them. And then nuts, if you look at this sort of figure, I mean, there's some big export almonds and macadamias. There's others, you're right. And we were looking at that, and I'm sure your industry was looking at all these barriers being imposed on and thinking, shaking in your shoes, weren't you?
Well, our company just said we must lose your exposure to China today.
Yeah.
So we had to do it. We had to do it because we were absolutely shitting ourselves that wine tariff would hit macadamias because they could get it from somewhere else. So we had to unravel a decade of market development and penetration and research and engagement. All that, turn it all off quickly because of the importance of that market. If a tariff hit it, just all the product would come.
Really, yeah. But then it didn't. And then the big thing about, I'll talk to you later about elements of this.
Sorry, Scott, I'm conscious you got a lot of questions coming in online as well, so I don't want to.
No, go.
But I was very. Well, okay, there we go. So Brodie, Paul, China policy. A lot of the, and I'm also on the Australia-China Business Council, and it just seems one of the elements that really piqued my interest in your presentation was the interest groups in the AD, in the CBD issues. And whether in your work or your research, you felt that to what degree there was a channel for Australia to get inside the decision-making process, or building relationships at those subgroup levels would assist our conversation and understanding for the next series of events, because our relationships with China as China develops are always going to be up and down.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And if you remember that period, it was really quite difficult to get engagement between policymakers at all, but especially
I remember
at
the
the
ambassador saying that they've just stopped talking to us, but that doesn't mean that there weren't conversations going on at a lower level.
Yep, and that was a bit strained too, but there were conversations going on all the time. And it's the obvious thing, right? If the Australian barley industry was hit with all these tariffs, then they've got a very strong interest in talking to the China beer, SADA, China Beer Sub-Association, because they've got common interests. And I'm sure those conversations happened. And then that led into the formal processes, right? That made submissions, not joint submissions, but made submissions against the barriers working together. And even for wine, the Chinese Alcoholic Drinks Association Wine Sub-Association was the applicant. It asked MOFCOM to investigate the dumping of Australian wine, and then they ruled that dumping. And the Australian wine industry, that directly affected very badly the Australian wine industry.